right. Hey, everybody. First, let's do an audio check. Can somebody post, let me know that you're hearing me okay? Great. There's a 10-second delay built into YouTube, so that's why it takes me a minute for me to see your comments and respond. So, all right, great. So, nice job on the baby names. There's some really good ones here. I think I really like Emerald Wind Forest. She's probably my favorite. Although I'm feeling kind of sorry for Skinny Geothermal Rock. Maybe he'll grow into that name, but yeah. All right. So let's move over to the learning catalytics for a second. All right. So number one, the biggest problem with geothermal is that it's limited around the globe, right? Only those places where there's really where it's close enough to the surface. Although if we can get the technology there, we can go deeper. But right now we can't. The next one, home-based geothermal, is not about hot rocks. It's about the fact that the ground is around 50 degrees, and we can exploit that for heating and cooling. Wave power is around 30 years behind wind power. And the thing about biomass is all of the things associated with combustion, right? So NOx, particulates, and ozone. Okay. So today we are transitioning, and we started the class with climate change, right? Then we moved into renewables. And so we finished up with renewables. And now we are moving into a new segment where we're going to be talking about water and effects on water, and impacts to water. And there's a lot to talk about. So let's get started. You've been seeing the water cycle since probably what, third grade, right? So let's start with that, right? The water cycle starts, of course, with evaporation. Water goes through the sky, condenses back down, and precipitates back down onto the land, where then it runs off and carries a bunch of things with it as it runs off. Simultaneously, it's seeping back into the ground, where plant roots can pick it back up, pull it up through the leaves, and transpire it back out into the atmosphere again. What doesn't get picked up by plants percolates through the ground, getting cleaned up along the way. And some of it moves very, very slowly, sits in the groundwater. Some of it moves more quickly, but all of it eventually makes it back down to a stream or a river or the ocean in the end. And the cycle continues and continues. We hear a lot of talk about water scarcity, and I wanted to put that into context about what scarcity really means. You know, the Earth is a water planet, right? The planet is covered with, it's 70% water on the surface, right? It's a lot of water. So, but you hear about water scarcity all the time. So when we talk about water being scarce, what we're really talking about is fresh water being scarce, right? Because of all the water that's out there, um, only a small sliver of it right here is actually fresh water or water that's not salty, right? Only 2.5% of it is actually water that's not salty. And of that portion that's fresh, a bunch of that is locked up in ice, in glaciers or in permanent snow cover up on the tops of mountains, right? So you end up with only a really small percentage, in other words, 0.77% of all the water on the planet is actually available fresh water to us. And so that's what makes it a scarce resource, because the stuff that we can actually drink is actually a very small portion of the total. One of the things that's really important for us to understand and that makes the water cycle so important and that makes it really bad when we short circuit the water cycle in some ways, which we'll talk about in a minute, is kind of what I'll call the miracle of soil. And this is a laboratory picture where they're kind of mimicking and testing what soil does to water. But soil, it turns out, is actually passing water through soil is the best way to clean it up. It turns out that soil is an incredibly effective purifier of water. And so, I mean, you can pass polluted water through a soil column, which is what they're doing here in this laboratory. And a lot of those pollutants get removed and broken down, because not only is it just a physical filter, but it's a biological filter as well, because soil is full of microbes. I mean, literally billions of microbes in a teaspoon of soil. And a lot of them munch down on pollutants, right? They can eat things like oil and all kinds of nasty chemicals. I mean, just think about it. I don't know how many of you live in a home in a rural or semi-rural area where you have a septic system, right? But a septic system is essentially where all the wastewater in your house, right, sewage and everything, just goes out into a tank, and then the tank spreads all that wastewater out in the underground, and then lets it percolate through soil, a couple feet of soil, and then go into the groundwater. And by passing that nasty water through the soil, it gets cleaned up. And not only does it get cleaned up, but it continues to clean up year after year after year. And houses use septic systems for decades, right? I'm sitting in a house right now, and this house has been here since 1966 or something. And the same septic field has been being used for that entire time, cleaning up all the nasties that have come out of the house for all that time, just that same patch of soil, which is pretty darn amazing, right? So soil is a semi-miraculous natural purifier. So that's really important to remember when we do things to water where we prevent it from being able to pass through soil, what I'm calling short-circuiting the water cycle, because we prevent nature from doing what nature has always done, right? This passing through of water through soil is really, really important. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. Maybe some of you have seen things on the landscape called rain gardens. They're starting to be more popular. They're alternatives to using big old ponds to hold runoff water from maybe like a development. Maybe you've been like to Walmart or Best Buy or something, and you see these gigantic water ponds that hold all the runoff water, right? That comes from a site after a storm, right? And now we're starting to try and mimic nature instead of just holding the water back in those big ponds. And very often that water's polluted from all the stuff that runs off of the parking lots. What we're trying to do is mimic nature by creating areas where the water can percolate through and putting all of that soil to good use. So we're starting to see more and more areas, and this is an area that I've worked on a lot, where um, we build specific areas on the landscape, maybe in a parking lot, where you capture that runoff water, and then you have soil that you've put in there that's really permeable, that you let the water make the water go through, um, and it can accommodate a lot of water moving through right after a rainstorm. And these areas are designed to let a lot of water move through, and they can be really, really effective in cleaning up polluted water that comes off of a site. We call them rain gardens. There's actually a number of them around campus. If you look on the side of Jepson, heading toward Eagle Village, you'll see one. There's a couple other little ones tucked around campus. They just kind of look like landscaped areas. They're a little kind of low and depressed on the landscape, but they're rain gardens, and they're environmental features. They're meant to treat polluted runoff to protect streams downstream. Against this kind of stuff, right? I bet you guys have been in a parking lot and seen that, right? That's the swirly color stuff, right? This right here, right? After a rainstorm, like you get out of the car in a parking lot and you've seen this kind of swirly rainbowy color, right? That's oil when oil mixes with water, oil that's dripped from a car, right? Just think about it. Like, just imagine, a big parking lot near you, like say, your nearest Walmart or Target parking lot, right? And it's the summertime and it hasn't rained for 2 weeks. And imagine every car coming in, right? Day after day after day, every single car comes in, and as they stop, they put on their brakes, right? And every time a car puts on their brakes, there's friction between the brake pads and the metal, and a little bit of friction wears off the brake pads, and a little bit of nasty dust falls off. That's a pollutant. In fact, it's a really toxic pollutant. And every so often, and actually not every so often, pretty frequently, cars are dripping oil, right? And a drip or so comes off of every car. And some cars are dripping antifreeze, which is toxic, and that drips off. And all this stuff starts to accumulate: the toxic dust, the oil, the antifreeze, and who knows what else on the pavement, just sitting there, right? Waiting for the next rainstorm. And in the summer, that could be, a week and a half, 2 weeks before a rainstorm comes, just waiting for that next rainstorm to come. And when it does, and you get the big thunderstorm that comes through, that first flush is like a toxic cocktail of nastiness, of pollution that comes flushing off of a parking lot and makes its way to the nearest stream. And so that we call it stormwater runoff, runoff from rainstorms, and it can be really detrimental downstream to creatures that are living in the water. And that's why it's really important to do things to help capture that water, remove that pollution. So what we're talking about today is there's this natural hydrologic cycle, right, that you've learned about since forever. And I want to talk about the ways that humans impact that natural cycle and mess it up, and in doing so cause all kinds of ecological problems. Okay, so we're going to go through 5 or 6 different ways that humans impact the hydrologic cycle. Okay, feel free to chime in with questions over chat. The first one is loss of vegetation. Okay, so you've probably seen this happen, hopefully not as bad as that picture, but in a development site gets built, right? Some houses, maybe a construction site. And what do? Right? They have to clear the land in order to be able to build those places. Sometimes they clear a lot of it at once. And before they're able to get it revegetated, right, rainstorm comes through and there's nothing there to hold it together, right? There's no roots to hold the soil together. And there's also no leaves to intercept the rain before it hits the ground. And it just leads to lots and lots of erosion. So the fact that there's no leaves to intercept the rain, we call that increased raindrop impact. So it turns out that having vegetation in the way of rain actually absorbs a whole lot of the energy of the rainfall, so that because the raindrop carries a lot of momentum with it, right? That can dislodge soil, and just having rain, just having leaves in between the heavy rainfall in the soil reduces its eroding ability. But that's gone, as you see in this picture. So a single raindrop can do a lot of damage, can displace earth, soil. And then very quickly, the layer, what they call the soil duff layer on the top, the kind of the what you see in the forest, a little bit of spongy soil, kind of organic material on the top of any natural soil, gets washed away. So there's no spongy effect of ability to absorb rainfall. Instead, it's just open, bare dirt, and it can get washed away. And that dirt and mud that you're seeing there in the screen is going to make its way down to the nearest stream. And if you're a critter living in that stream, you're not going to like it. If you're a little fish, well, it's going to get in your gills and probably choke you. And if you're a critter that lives on the bottom and can't move, there's a good chance it's going to settle on top of you and suffocate you. So sediment like this is a pretty bad thing. And that's why you find that streams in developing areas, urbanizing areas, are very often dead. Not much life in them. It also means that a whole lot more water runs off in developed areas, because when there are roots and plants growing, all of those little roots going down into the soil are little pathways that allow rainfall to make its way into the ground, right, and recharge. And so a rainstorm event that may be an inch, well, when there's plants on the ground, 3/4 of an inch of that rain could actually just get sucked up right into the ground when there's plants there, because if the rain follows the root tracks down in. But when you have something like this you see in the picture, most of that rain will just run off, because it just becomes slippery, and there's no pathways for the water to infiltrate into the ground. So more water runs off. That's why in urban areas, developed areas, when you drive over a little bridge and you see that the streams fill up with water really fast after a rainfall event and turn brown really fast. That's why, because the ground has lost its ability to recharge, to accept water, because those plants and their root structures aren't there allowing water to go back in. And so all that erosion means downstream everything gets dirtier, and critters that lived in the streams die. So that's number one. We're talking about ways that humans impact the hydrologic cycle. We come in, we remove vegetation, and it messes up the runoff portion. Number two, increasing impervious cover. So let me explain what impervious means. Impervious means something that doesn't let water go through. Okay, so impervious means an impervious cover would be something like a roadway, a sidewalk, or rooftop, right? All of those things are impervious to water. Water can't percolate through them. Right. So take a look at the comparison here on the left, right? So when a site is in a natural forest, okay, and rain falls on it, only about 10% of the rainfall actually runs off, okay? A whole bunch of it goes into deep infiltration, about 1/4 of it, or shallow infiltration, and a bunch gets absorbed and then evapotranspired out. Now take a look at that same site after it's developed, okay? And the site becomes 75 to 100% impervious, right? So like a downtown area, right? All of a sudden now it goes from 10% runoff to 55% runoff. That rain fall now, most of that now is being pushed off to the stream. But take a look at this. The infiltration drops tremendously. We went from 25% deep infiltration to 5%, 25% shallow to 10%. There's your water supply, folks, right? That's where we look for it. That's our groundwater not being recharged because the surface is impervious. We've essentially put a cap on it right here, right? We've essentially sealed off the surface of the ground, and so very little surface remains for water to be able to percolate back in, and so the ground can't be recharged by rainfall, and we can't recharge our groundwater stores. So more water runs off as surface water flow in the streams, which actually causes the streams to erode themselves more and transports more dirt downstream. So simply by the process of development and installing impervious cover, we also tweak and impact the hydrologic cycle, right? By preventing infiltration, which affects our drinking water stores, and also sends a whole lot more water into streams, which can cause a bunch of erosion downstream because the stream tries to get bigger, essentially, to accommodate for that. Decreased infiltration, I mentioned that. Decreased evapotranspiration, I mentioned that. Oh, yeah, and the other is that because the water's not going through the soil anywhere near as much, it's short-circuiting the natural purification route. Remember, we talked about at the very beginning how soil is nature's great cleansing mechanism for water, right? And so when we put pavement down or rooftop, we short circuit that, and so the water can't go through the soil and it can't be cleansed, and that's what we call a short circuit on nature's cleansing process. All right, so take a look at this graph for a second. This and I want you to look at the pictures in kind of a clockwise fashion, like following the red dot here, from this spot all the way around to this spot. Okay, and what we're looking at is an increase. Each picture is an increase in impervious cover in a watershed. Okay, so this is a watershed here with 5% impervious cover, a pretty natural looking stream. This is a watershed with around 8 to 10% impervious cover. Start to notice the changes that you're seeing in the streams, okay, or in the streams and the stream banks. This is a watershed with around 20% impervious cover. Notice the pipe here. This pipe was the stream bank was at one point in time located right here, so that the beginning of this pipe was at the edge of the stream bank. So the bank has cut back over time. That's at 20% impervious cover. Here's a watershed at 30% impervious cover. And here's a watershed at 65% impervious cover. Literally, when you get up to levels of impervious cover that high in a watershed, the intensity of water flow is so high that you typically have to harden the banks. So maybe you've seen, if any of you live up in Northern Virginia, like Cameron Run, up in Alexandria, looks like that, and some streams in Fairfax, because such intensive amounts of development and impervious cover up there, pushing 90%. So this is telling us a story, right? As watersheds grow in impervious cover, the amount of pavement, rooftop, streams respond, right? The streams get more and more water in them, and as because of more and more runoff, right? All that water is getting short circuited and run off instead of infiltrating. And the streams respond by trying to make themselves bigger, right? They're starting to cut wider and wider and wider channels, and that's causing lots and lots of erosion. In general, we found that around 8% of impervious cover seems to be the threshold at which watersheds really start to show signs of impact. And that's the number I'd like you guys to remember. 8% seems to be the threshold of impervious cover where watersheds start to show significant downstream impacts. 8%. Okay, the third way that humans impact the hydrologic cycle is by removing wetlands in the landscape. So wetlands are, just like the word says, areas of land that are wet at least part of the year. Sometimes they're completely underwater, sometimes they're just soggy. Sometimes wetlands are just areas that may be wet in the wintertime, dry in the summertime. But wetlands are really important. They're a really important habitat. And they're really important areas for storing water as part of the hydrologic cycle. But humans have had a propensity to want to fill in wetlands because we've seen them as wastelands or areas that we'd really like to, that we see as potentially developable if only we could get rid of the water, right? And so over history, we have filled in a large percentage of the wetlands in this country, usually for development purposes, right? And a lot of that has gone on in coastal areas, but also inland too. And in recent decades, they've passed a number of laws to help protect wetlands, but wetlands are still have still gone through and continue to have some losses. Okay, wetlands play a really important role in buffering floods. Okay, so that's where when waters rise, wetlands are kind of the place where the flood waters can go. If you don't have wetlands, you've probably got development there, and that means lands are going to get totally developed areas are going to get flooded. As we've learned time after time with hurricanes, right? And development along the coast where people with really large and expensive beach houses that have built in areas that were previously wetlands and coastal marshes. Right? And if we had preserved those coastal marshes, those areas could have served as buffers and absorbed the energy of the storms. But many of those areas we've kind of filled in or reclaimed to make hard ground, and that has prevented, and in doing so, we've lost the buffering ability of the wetlands. And we paid the price because by building hard structures there, they've taken the brunt of the storms, and people have lost, or society has lost billions and billions of dollars to storm impacts because we didn't understand the benefits that wetlands were providing. Wetlands provide what we call ecosystem services. They're because water moves through them and passes past vegetation and moves through the soil, they're really good at cleaning up water. Wetlands are great pollutant removers, and they also provide lots of habitat for all kinds of creatures. They especially provide nursery habitat for baby creatures. So in the coastal areas, they're providing habitat for all kinds of organisms in their juvenile stages that then grow up to be big, commercially important, like think crabs, for example, right? So a lot of for the juvenile stages of crabs come up and into wetlands, right? And when crabs are molting and going through their life cycles, they come up and hang out on the reeds, right? And because the nice thing about wetlands is they're all full of grasses and stuff, right? And so little organisms can hide from their predators in between the reeds and stuff. So they make for really good refuge from predators. So when you get rid of a wetland, you get rid of the nursery areas. You get rid of the water quality protections that come with wetlands. Like nitrogen removal, which is, they're really good at that. They're also a really good food source. Wetlands, that's why you can see, if you ever watch if you're near a river or the coast and you watch the geese fly over, they're often looking for areas of vegetated wetlands, and when they're doing their migrations, and the head goose flying in the flock, he's looking, and when he sees a nice wetland that has lots of green vegetation, that they kind of dive bomb down and are going to eat it. And wetlands have all kinds of great food in them. And they're not, some people think that that's where groundwater gets recharged, but in general, it's not. Wetlands are not groundwater recharge areas. So I want you to remember in particular that the loss of the wetlands along coasts, or what we call tidal wetlands, where the tides go up and down, particularly affects our protection from storms, because wetlands serve as the buffer for storms, for storm energy, like big waves and stuff. They can absorb the storm energy. All right. The next way that we mess up the water cycle is dams. And this goes all the way back to the first time we met together, and we talked about Embry Dam. This is Embry Dam, the one that we blew up on the Rappahannock, that no longer exists. And so you have a sense of that, right? Dams cause all kinds of problems. Number one, they block passage for migratory fish. So if you were a fish trying to get upstream here, you can see this is kind of like a fisheye view, right? You can kind of see that that's the end of the line, unless you can jump 22 feet, right? Which I don't know of any fish that can do that. So it's the end of the line for you. They also prevent the normal distribution of sediment downstream. So remember how I talked about how even though this particular dam was 22 feet high, right from here to here, it actually was full of sediment all the way up to that red dot right there. Actually, even higher than that, about right there, right? So all that sediment was, had accumulated over the years, and it turns out a certain amount of sediment going downstream is important because organisms need sediment. This is really, really important out west. The sandbars that get created by the flow of sediment are needed by downstream creatures. And so those big dams, think like the Hoover Dam and such, on the Colorado, they capture so much sediment that they starve the downstream river of the sediment it needs to create sandbars that other creatures need for their habitat. So unintended consequences. We talked about fish passage, right? And that's one way to get around the problem if you've got fish that are capable of jumping. So that's a fish ladder that can be used when you got the right fish, like a salmon. All right. Oh yeah, I want to show this. Just 1 second. I can't show that one. Just a moment while I load this up.
Border of Washington State and Oregon. Ben Tracy shows us how the Washington State and Oregon. Ben Tracy shows us how the fish are hitching a ride.
This is not your average salmon spawning season on the Washougal River.
It's interesting, to say the least.
Thanks to this machine,
The whoosh, you know.
these salmon are in for the ride of their lives.
Oh yeah, real fun to watch.
It does have an official name,
It is the whoosh fish transport system.
but you could also simply call it
A pretty sweet piece of technology known as the salmon cannon. We started with goldfish and trout and tilapia, and we worked our way right up to salmon.
Todd Deligan is the vice president of Whoosh Innovations.
It's the sound of an object traveling in the tube.
The contraption took just 20 minutes to set up. It moves salmon from this holding pen through a pressurized tube, and with the help of a little water, 5 seconds later, they reach a truck 150 feet away.
It's a different thing to see fish just flying up a tube like that.
Greg Haldy is with the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. It bought this salmon cannon to help separate hatchery salmon from wild salmon in the river. Until now, workers use these bins and a forklift to do the job. A process that was tougher on them and the salmon.
So we'd have to do that 3-4 times until the truck was filled, and then we'd have to do it all over again.
The salmon cannon gets it done in half the time, with a lot less labor, and they say with no danger to the fish.
All right, show us how you do this. So I've got hatchery buck here. Insert it, and the whoosh does its thing.
Originally, this technology was designed to move apples from tree to truck in less time and without bruising them. And then one day the company wondered, could they make fish fly?
When you realized this thing could move fish through the way it does, what was the reaction of your team?
We laughed at first, and then we thought that this really has the potential for addressing some of the very serious issues that we face here in the Pacific Northwest.
Drought in the West is dramatically drying up salmon runs. Man-made dams on rivers have kept some species from their spawning grounds for decades. Some dams are now being destroyed, but on other rivers, it could be the salmon cannon to the rescue.
Instead of trucking the fish around the dam, they would just shoot them up and over the dam.
Even easier than shooting fish out of a barrel.
So if they made a human-sized one of these things, would you take a ride?
Absolutely.
You whoosh yourself.
Sure.
In the meantime, it's the fish having all the fun. For CBS This Morning, Ben Tracy in Washington State.
All right. Well, I want a salmon cannon. Okay, the next way that we interfere with the hydrologic cycle is disconnection of floodplains. So I need to explain this one, right? So think about, a river like this, right? That does the normal meandering that a river does, right? And a river has what you call floodplains, right? These areas along the side where the river floods into, right? And those are really important, right? The river needs that to be able to, because the energy of the flood gets dissipated when it can move out into these kind of low forest areas or wetlands along either side um, when a flood happens, right? It's really important that those forests and wetlands along the sides of rivers are left intact. But as humans are wont to do, we've gotten in the habit of kind of doing things to straighten rivers or to go in and develop on the sides of rivers and get rid of those natural floodplains on the side. And that has caused some real problems. The biggest is it makes the energy of the floods a lot stronger. Because just think about it. If you have a dense forest on the side of a flooding river, when the floodwater goes out into that dense forest, well, it hits all the trees and everything slows down, and the water gets all the energy gets absorbed by the vegetation in the floodplain. If you straighten a river, or if you build levees along the side of it, right, that river becomes like a pipe almost, and the energy becomes super strong. And when that river gets down to the next curve, right, what's it gonna do? It's gonna hit it with a lot of force and blow out the bank, right? And that's exactly what happens. Also, when you don't have those floodplains for a river to go into, you lose all of the benefits of the sediment that usually flows out from a river, and that usually enriches the soil. You think about the Nile, like you learned about that in school, right? And how the Nile Delta was so fertile because the river overflowed all the time, right? Well, all river floodplains are like that. They're very fertile because of floodwaters bringing in fertile sediment. But when you disconnect a river from its floodplain by straightening it, by building levees along the side, or embankments along the side, the river can't do that. And so you lose all the benefits of good soil, and you lose the wetlands. And we just talked about the benefits of wetlands. And probably nowhere is there a better kind of object lesson story of the dangers of doing this than the Everglades in Florida, and in particular the river that feeds the Everglades, called the Kissimmee River. And some of you who are in my 230 class have heard me talk about this before. The Kissimmee River and what we did to it is a real tragedy, but it was a huge learning lesson for the United States in what happens when you go in and straighten a river and disconnect a river from its floodplain. So I just want to watch the first minute or so or two of this to give you a sense of what they did, and then we'll talk about it. Just give me a second here to get it set up.
The lesson of the Kissimmee River. Restoration works. Native Americans called it the Kissimmee River, or Long Water. It was gentle and meandering, a paradise for thousands of wading birds, including herons, ibis, egrets, and wood storks. During the winter months, as many as 16 species of waterfowl annually migrated to the highly productive floodplain. The historic river rose out of central Florida's chain of lakes and gently wove its way south through a 167-kilometer course, emptying into Lake Okeechobee. Its 2 to 5 kilometer wide floodplain provided a rich wetland habitat for many fish and wildlife species. In times of drought, the river remained within its banks. When rainfall was plentiful, water flowed across the floodplain, which often remained inundated for long periods of time. To balance these sweeping hydrological fluctuations and provide flood protection to newly emerging communities, the state of Florida asked the federal government to devise a flood control plan for Central and South Florida. As a result, a 90-kilometer-long, 100-meter-wide, 9-meter-deep flood control channel was excavated through the floodplain. The project was highly successful at providing flood control. However, the environmental impacts were catastrophic. The channelized river, now a series of pools controlled by water control structures, converted 44% of the floodplain to pasture, draining approximately 12,150 hectares of wetlands. This action severely impacted native fish and wildlife populations, including a 92% decrease in migratory waterfowl and a 74% decrease in the bald eagle population. Even before the project was completed in 1971, questions arose about the loss of the river's ecological integrity. Scientists and engineers concerned about these losses began to study the possibility of restoring the river floodplain system. Vital information in determining whether Kissimmee River and floodplain restoration was feasible came from a demonstration project conducted by the South Florida Water Management District in the mid to late 1980s. Several project components, including rediversion of the flow from the flood control canal back to the original river channel and reflooding of approximately 35% of the floodplain within the project area, were evaluated to determine whether hydrologic restoration of the river and floodplain would be feasible and beneficial. Results of the study convincingly showed that restoration was feasible and that reestablishing historic hydrologic conditions would result in the expected beneficial biological and environmental responses by vegetation, fish, and wildlife communities. As a result of the demonstration project, in 1992, the federal government authorized a joint state-federal project to restore the river, with the South Florida Water Management District partnering with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In 1994, a project test fill on the flood control canal was initiated to determine the most efficient method of filling the canal and to determine the impacts of restoration construction on water quality and downstream transport of suspended material. A 300-meter section of canal was filled with the spoil material originally dredged to form the canal. Assessment.
Okay. So hopefully you followed what they were saying there. This was, probably to put it mildly, one of the biggest boondoggles in the history of environmental management in this country. We took a natural river system that fed the Everglades that looked like this, and thinking that and a system that normally flooded every year, it was a natural cycle, and said, we need to come in and we know best, and we're going to fix those floods by turning it into this. And in the process, we disconnected all of those natural wetlands on the sides here and turned them into pasture land, agriculture actually. And in the process, absolutely devastated the ecology of the system. It was engineering mindset without any thought toward ecology. And even before they had completed it, they recognized that they had made a massive mistake and began, this was 60 miles worth of channelized river system. And it caused, one, the loss of the wetlands, their ecosystem services, right? All the habitat, all the flood control, all the pollution removal, flooding, and in particular, higher energy flooding. This probably shows it the best. Let me just play this as like a really quick animation that will actually show you visually what the conversion did.
The original Kissimmee River meandered over 100 miles from Lake Kissimmee to Lake Okeechobee. When it rained, the river swelled into a large floodplain almost 2 miles wide, though only a few feet deep. During the drier winter season, the river would shrink back into its slow, twisting course. This cycle was critical to the many species of organisms that thrived along the Kissimmee. When citizens demanded protection from floods, the Army Corps of Engineers channelized the river, transforming it into a 56-mile-long canal. By draining almost 35,000 acres of floodplain, more than 68 miles of remnant river ceased to flow. But with the vanishing marsh, so went the natural filters that protected the river from phosphorus and other agricultural and urban runoffs. And that set up a direct pipeline seeping contaminated water straight into the heart of the Everglades.
So it was a hard lesson to learn and a really, really expensive lesson. So the federal government stepped back in and said, we need to undo what we did. And so you can see here, here's the channelized Kissimmee, and then they came back in and undid the channelization and recreated the natural system again. And that process took another 20 years, and phase 3 of that has just been wrapping up to the tune of $9 billion to restore what they did, the boondoggle that they did on the Kissimmee River. And one of the reasons they did it is because it was causing absolute havoc downstream in the Everglades and the amount of pollution that it was putting into the downstream system. It was a hard, hard lesson to learn. All right, number 6. The next way that we interfere with the natural hydrologic cycle is by taking water out, right? Water withdrawal. Surface water and groundwater. We can pull groundwater out, and when we do that, if we're near the coast, we're near the ocean, well, by pulling water out from underneath you near the ocean can allow salt water from the ocean to come in and fill in where the fresh water was underneath. And that's called saltwater intrusion. And when we remove excess water from the surface, that can also kill in-stream organisms because there's just not enough water left in a river, right? So you can literally suck a river dry. That's happened in places, and we'll talk about that. And sometimes if you pull a lot of water out and you say, hey, it's okay, we're letting that water run back into the river after we irrigate plants with it, a lot of it just runs back. Well, the problem with that is that what they call return flows are often highly polluted with the chemicals that they've picked up as they run off of a farm field. So there's a lot of issues there. But let's talk first about saltwater intrusion, or watch this quick little snippet. with me.
Understand the groundwater shortage our community is facing, we must go deep on. To understand the groundwater shortage our community is facing, we must go deep underground. Here at several hundred feet below the Earth's surface, the groundwater that people in the Soquel Creek Water District use is stored between rocks and sand. Rainfall seeps into the groundwater aquifers and slowly flows underground to the ocean, or returns to the surface as a spring or directly into a river before reaching the ocean. The freshwater underground creates a buffer near the shore where freshwater and salty ocean water meet. When wells draw more water out of the ground than is naturally replenished by rain, groundwater levels begin to drop. Salty ocean water moves inland and mixes with the fresh groundwater. As seawater moves inland, wells that once drew fresh drinking water become salty and unusable. Soquel Creek Water District has detected increased salts in several monitoring wells along the coast. We take this problem very seriously and are determined to prevent any further seawater intrusion into the groundwater. We are working hard on multiple solutions to protect our community's groundwater supply, including finding new water sources and helping the community continue to use less water.
One of the things they're doing, this is a big deal, especially down in Florida, where there's such a high concentration of people. And one of the things they're actually doing nowadays is taking treated wastewater. So, after the water comes out of a wastewater treatment plant, and injecting it back into the ground. Instead of releasing it to rivers, they're injecting it into the groundwater to kind of push the salt water back so that their wells don't get contaminated. All right, so let me tell you a little story about water withdrawal. And this takes place in the Colorado River Basin. So everybody's familiar with the Colorado River Basin, right? It's the river that makes the Grand Canyon. And so it's a huge river basin, right? It drains, multiple states, you can see there. And the Colorado carries a massive amount of water, right? It has to carve the Grand Canyons. And you can see here, there's the Hoover Dam, and you just get a sense of the amount of water that the Colorado moves. And the Colorado is also, though, because it travels through an arid portion of the country, is under high demand for irrigation, right? A massive amount of pipes are stuck into the river and diversions to pull that water out, to send water to far-flung places to irrigate crops, to grow food, for the food that you and I eat. So much so that this is the Colorado River where it meets the sea. In other words, so we pull so much water out of the Colorado River that it doesn't make it to the sea. It's hard to imagine that a river with that much flow could be sucked completely dry. But it has been. And that it doesn't make it to the Gulf of Baja California. And that's, an immense tragedy and an ecological disaster, because there is a huge wetland delta there that was fed by the Colorado River that is now a dry dead zone because of it. So, how could this happen, right? How do the laws let this happen? Well, it goes back to water rights and the West. And, probably for most of you, if you've grown up here in the Eastern United States, it's kind of hard to imagine. Water is a different thing out West. Water is everything out West. Water is as important as oil. out west. And it's so important that everybody has water rights, right? Every bit of flow of water has been allocated, right, in rivers. And when you buy land, it may have a water right associated with the deed as to how much water you can pull from a nearby water source. And so way back in 1922, the flow of the Colorado was divided up to various places and landowners and states and entities based on a flow, a history of flow of the river. But it turned out that history of flow of the river was a series of wet years. They didn't know that at the time, that they were looking at relatively wet years. So that meant that the allocation that they gave for the river was over allocated. In other words, they allocated 120% of the river's typical flow. So that when the river got back into normal flow patterns, well, there wasn't enough water to go around to people. And so what happened? Well, when people started exercising their water rights, the entire Colorado River was sucked dry. And that's what led to a situation that you see now on the where the Colorado meets the Gulf of Baja. Add on to that the fact that the climate's been changing, and the Colorado River has been flowing even less than average years. And so there's less and less water. So even with conservation going on, people have not been able to reduce their flows to equal to the amount of the flow of the Colorado River. And so the river continues to be overutilized before it can reach the Gulf, which is just an immense tragedy, right? And nobody wants to renegotiate their water rights because that would mean somebody having to give up something, right? That's the problem. So that has led to a project called Minute 319, which has been a many year negotiation process between a lot of non-governmental organizations like Environmental Defense Fund and Audubon Society to try and see if they could somehow meet in the middle to do something to restore the Colorado River Delta. And one of the things they figured out was that the river doesn't have to flow all the time in order to restore some of the ecology. In fact, what they really need is they realized that if they could have pulses of water a couple times a year, that if they could to come back through for a couple days at a time to saturate the soil, especially during the times when trees would normally drop their seeds, that could be enough to actually start to restore some of the ecology and plants in the wetlands. And so an initiative was born and negotiated to work out a way to allow the dams upstream to just release a pulse of water a few times a year. And in 2014, a compromise was worked out. And this is an international a negotiation that had to occur because actually the Colorado River crosses into Mexico before it enters into the Gulf there in Baja. So it had to be an international negotiation. But they did work something out. And for the first time in 20 years, just a couple of years ago, the very first pulse flow of water reached the Gulf of Baja from the Colorado River. And it was really, really remarkable and a huge celebration. So it's hard to imagine the first time in 20 years a river meets the sea. And what was really striking, though, was the resiliency of nature and how quickly the plants in the formerly dry Colorado River Delta started to come back to life. The plants that had been essentially in stasis for many years, and how quickly the the birds and other organisms returned, and actually tended to stay, even with just a relatively small amount of pulsing a couple times a year after that, so that the water came, saturated it, and then stayed in smaller pools for a period of time until another pulse came. So this is, it's not perfect. It's not what the river was before, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. And this all came about through the work of a bunch of citizens working through non-governmental organizations that pushed the government and said, this is outrageous. This river doesn't reach the sea, and that can't happen. And they made it work. And that's really a great thing. So I think that's good news to end on, actually. So we'll stop there. So that was our first foray here into water. We'll pick up with a couple more things on water when I see you on Tuesday. In the meantime, feel free to email me or set up a chat if you want to talk about anything. And I will see you next time, guys. Bye.